there is a moment right before everything changes when you don't even realize it's happening. It feels small, almost invisible. You stop replying as fast. You stop checking your phone every 5 minutes. You stop explaining yourself. And somewhere on the other side, something breaks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way ice cracks under weight nobody can see yet. This video is about that moment, about what happens in someone's mind, in their chest, in their sleepless nights, when the person they assume would always be there simply stops chasing, stops begging, stops trying. If you have ever wondered why silence feels louder than any argument you could ever win, why walking away sometimes says more than 1,000 messages, then stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to explain is not just a theory. It's a pattern rooted in human psychology, tested in relationships, friendships, even workplaces. The strange, uncomfortable, but undeniable truth about what happens when you finally completely stop giving someone your energy. And by the end of this video, you'll understand something that will change the way you see every relationship in your life. But first, let me tell you what happens in the first 60 seconds after you make that decision. Because it's not what you think. You'd expect relief. You'd expect peace. But that's not what comes first. What comes first is panic, your own panic. Your fingers hover over the screen. Your mind replays the last conversation, searching for a reason to reply just one more time. This is the hardest part, and almost nobody talks about it because the truth is, going quiet completely doesn't feel powerful in the beginning. It feels like losing. It feels like you're the one being punished, not them. But here's a twist nobody prepares you for. The moment you push through that panic, something on the other end starts to shift in a way you never expected. And I'm going to tell you exactly what that shift looks like, but not yet. Because to understand it, you need to understand why silence works the way it does on the human brain in the first place. Let's talk about something psychologists call the Zeigarnik effect. It's a strange little quirk of the human mind, discovered almost 100 years ago by a Russian psychologist who noticed something odd about waiters in a restaurant. They could remember complex, unpaid orders in perfect detail, but the moment the bill was paid, the memory vanished almost instantly. Unfinished things stick in our minds. Completed things fade. Think about that for a second. When you are constantly available, constantly replying, constantly explaining and chasing and proving your worth, you are, without realizing it, giving someone closure. You are completing the loop for them. Their brain files you away as handled, as settled, as understood. But the second you go quiet, the second you stop responding, stop initiating, stop trying to fix what they broke, you become an open loop, an unfinished sentence. And the human brain hates unfinished sentences more than almost anything else. It will replay them, obsess over them, circle back to them at 2 in the morning when the house is quiet and there's nothing left to distract from the thought that keeps knocking. This is not manipulation. I want to be very clear about that because there's a difference between using silence as a weapon and using silence as a boundary. What we're talking about here isn't a trick to control someone. It's what happens naturally, honestly, when you stop abandoning yourself to keep someone else comfortable. And that distinction matters because so many people confuse detachment with revenge. They think going quiet is about punishing someone, about making them suffer, about winning some invisible war. But real detachment isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't post cryptic captions or arrange to be seen somewhere just to prove a point. Real detachment is quiet because it's not for them anymore. It's for you. And that single distinction is the difference between healing and performing, even though from the outside, the two can look almost identical. Think about the last time someone in your life took you for granted. Maybe it was a partner who assumed you'd always forgive them. Maybe it was a friend who only called when they needed something. Maybe it was someone in your own family who knew deep down that no matter how they treated you, you would always come back around, always make the first move, always soften first. That assumption, that quiet, unspoken belief that you will always be there, is the exact thing that lets people stop trying. Why would anyone put in effort for something they already believe they have secured? Certainty kills effort. It kills desire. It kills the small electric anxiety that keeps people invested in each other. And the moment you remove that certainty, not through games, not through tricks, but through genuine, calm withdrawal, you introduce something that hasn't existed in that relationship in a long time: uncertainty. And uncertainty, whether we like to admit it or not, is one of the most powerful psychological forces there is. There's a concept in behavioral psychology called loss aversion, and it's one of the most well-documented biases in human decision-making. In simple terms, it means that losing something hurts almost twice as much as gaining the same thing feels good. Losing $50 feels worse than finding $50 feels good. And this doesn't just apply to money. It applies to attention. It applies to affection. It applies to people. As long as someone believes they still have access to you, your time, your forgiveness, your patience, there is nothing to lose and therefore nothing to feel. But the moment that access disappears, even if they never truly valued it while it was there, the brain registers that something has been taken away. And that registration, that quiet internal alarm, is often the first real emotional reaction some people have had in the entire relationship. I want you to sit with something for a second. Have you ever noticed how the people who chase the least are the ones everyone wants the most? It's not because they're doing something special. It's because their attention feels earned, not guaranteed. And the moment attention feels guaranteed, it stops feeling valuable. This is why the person who is constantly available, constantly forgiving, constantly the one to reach out first, often ends up feeling invisible, no matter how much love they're pouring out. Love without boundaries doesn't read as generosity to most people. It reads as availability. And availability, sadly, is something the human brain has been wired for thousands of years to undervalue, because anything that requires no effort to obtain rarely gets treated as precious. This isn't fair and it isn't kind, but it is consistent across cultures, across generations, across every kind of relationship you could name. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, because what happens next isn't just emotional, it's neurological. When someone is used to a certain pattern of attention and that pattern suddenly stops, the brain doesn't just notice the absence, it actively searches for it. This is the same mechanism behind addiction, behind habit loops, behind the reason your hand reaches for your phone, even when you know there's nothing new to see. Consistent attention, even negative attention, forms a kind of neurological groove, a pathway the brain returns to automatically. When that pathway suddenly goes silent, the brain doesn't calmly accept it. It searches, it checks, it refreshes, it waits. And in that waiting, something happens that no amount of pleading or arguing ever could have caused: genuine reflection. This is the part almost nobody expects. When you are present, constantly explaining your hurt, constantly trying to make someone understand what they did wrong, you are ironically giving their mind something to argue against. As long as there's a voice reminding them, defending itself, reacting, they don't have to sit with their own thoughts. They can deflect, they can get defensive. They can turn the conversation into a debate about tone, about timing, about anything except the truth. But silence removes the debate. There is nothing to argue with. There is nothing to deflect. There is only the echo of their own actions, replaying back to them with nobody there to soften it. And for a lot of people, that echo is more uncomfortable than any argument could ever be, because arguments end, echoes don't. I need to pause here and say something important, because this isn't just a video about romantic relationships, even though that's usually where people feel this the hardest. This applies to friendships that have quietly become one-sided, where you're the one who always texts first, always remembers the birthday, always shows up, while the other person treats your presence like background noise. It applies to family members who only remember you exist when they need something, who go months without a single check-in, and then act wounded the moment you stop reaching out first. It applies to coworkers who take credit for your effort and give nothing back, who lean on your reliability while never once considering what you might need in return. The pattern is the same everywhere. The less someone believes they can lose you, the less they invest in keeping you. And the only way that belief changes is not through arguing, not through explaining, not through trying harder, but through showing calmly and consistently that you are not a guarantee. But let's talk honestly about the part of this that hurts, because I don't want to pretend this is easy or instant or painless. In the beginning, choosing silence feels like losing control. You will want to check if they've seen your message. You will want to know if they're posting like nothing happened, laughing with friends, living a life that looks untouched by your absence. And here is something you need to hear clearly. What someone shows on the outside during this period is almost never an accurate reflection of what's happening on the inside. Human beings are performers by nature, especially when they suspect they're being watched, even a little. The version of someone that appears fine, unaffected, thriving, is often the most carefully constructed version they've ever shown you. Because admitting the silence is working would mean admitting they were wrong to assume you'd always stay. And very few people are willing to admit that in public, even to themselves. There's also something psychologists refer to as the mirror effect, and it plays a huge role in why going completely quiet creates such a strong reaction. Relationships, at their core, operate like a mirror. One person's energy tends to reflect back the energy they're receiving. If you give warmth, you often get warmth in return, at least from someone capable of reciprocating it. If you give chasing, you often get retreating, because chasing subconsciously signals, I need this more than you do. And very few people move towards someone who appears to need them more than they need themselves. But when you stop mirroring their coldness with your warmth, when you stop matching their inconsistencies with your consistency, the mirror flips. Suddenly, they're the one seeing an unfamiliar reflection. Someone calm, someone unreachable, someone who used to reach first but no longer does. And people are far more disturbed by unfamiliar silence than familiar noise, because noise, even painful noise, can be predicted. Silence cannot. Let's go back to something I mentioned earlier, the idea that this isn't about revenge. I want to expand on that because there's a version of this advice that gets twisted into something toxic, something manipulative, something designed purely to make another person suffer. That is not what real detachment looks like, and it's not what actually creates change. Detachment rooted in bitterness still keeps you emotionally tethered to that person because you're still organizing your behavior around their reaction. You're still checking to see if it's working, still measuring your peace against their response. Real detachment, the kind that actually transforms a dynamic, comes from something much quieter. The decision that you deserve consistency and you're no longer willing to perform emotional labor for someone who offers none in return. That decision isn't about them at all. It's about you finally choosing yourself after however long you spent choosing everyone else first. And this is where the psychology gets almost paradoxical, because the less you focus on their reaction, the more powerful your silence becomes. People can sense performance. They can sense when someone is going quiet as a strategy, a countdown, a game with a finish line. But they cannot fake detect genuine peace. When your silence comes from actual healing rather than a calculated wait for an apology, it carries a different weight entirely. It stops being a test and becomes a truth. And truths are always more unsettling than tests, because tests can be passed. Truths have to be faced, sat with, and eventually accepted, whether someone is ready to accept them or not. There's a psychological principle called intermittent reinforcement that explains why some of the most painful relationships are also the hardest to walk away from. It comes from behavioral research on reward patterns, and it shows something counterintuitive. Rewards that come unpredictably create stronger attachment than rewards that come consistently. Think about it this way. If someone treated you badly every single day without exception, walking away would be easy. But if someone treats you badly most days and then every so often gives you a glimpse of the person you fell for in the first place, a kind word, a good day, a moment of real connection, your brain clings to that unpredictability the same way it clings to a slot machine. You start chasing the good moments, hoping they'll become the norm, when really they were the exception all along. Recognizing this pattern is one of the most important steps in understanding why silence feels so hard to maintain and also why it works. Because the moment you stop chasing the unpredictable reward, the entire cycle that kept you hooked loses its grip. Now let's talk about what typically happens on the other side of this silence, because there is usually a pattern, even though every situation is different. First comes denial, a kind of forced indifference, sometimes even displayed publicly, as if unaffected. Then comes curiosity, quiet check-ins, maybe through mutual friends, maybe through social media, small moves that look casual but aren't. Then, if the silence continues, something deeper starts to surface, reflection. This is the stage most people never get to witness because it happens privately, often at night, often when there's nothing left to distract from it. It's the stage where some finally has to ask themselves the questions they avoided while you were still reaching out to fix things for them. Why did I take that for granted? Why did I assume they'd always stay? What did I actually lose? And for some people, this stage is followed by a real, sincere attempt to change. For others, it's followed by something quieter and sadder, a private regret they never voice out loud because pride won't let them. But here's something you need to hear. And I say this with as much honesty as I can, because this video isn't meant to sell you a fairy tale. Not everyone reaches that stage. Some people are so deeply comfortable in patterns of taking, so unaccustomed to consequence, that silence doesn't create reflection. It creates replacement. They simply move on to someone new who hasn't yet learned their patterns, someone who will play the same role you used to play, at least for a while, until they too eventually run out of energy to keep giving without receiving. And this is exactly why detachment cannot be about waiting for someone to come back. If it is, you haven't actually detached. You've just gone quiet while still holding the door open. Real detachment means you would be at peace either way. Whether they come back changed or don't come back at all, the goal was never their return. The goal was your own return to yourself, to your peace, to the version of you that existed before you started shrinking to keep someone else comfortable. There's a reason this topic resonates with so many people, and it's not because everyone has a specific person they're trying to win back. It's because almost everyone at some point has experienced the specific pain of being undervalued by someone who knew they didn't have to try, a parent who only calls when it's convenient for them, a friend who disappears until they need a favor, then reappears as if no time has passed, a partner who apologizes with words but never with a single changed action. And the psychology here isn't really about one specific person. It's about the universal human experience of realizing your presence has become optional in someone's life and deciding whether you're going to keep proving your worth to people who've already made up their mind not to see it. Let's talk for a moment about self-worth, because that's really the foundation this entire video stands on. Psychologists often describe self-worth not as a fixed trait, but as a kind of internal thermostat, a set point that determines how much mistreatment, inconsistency, or neglect a person will tolerate before something inside them finally says enough. When that thermostat is set low, people accept crumbs and call it a meal. They chase silence and call it love. They explain themselves endlessly to people who never intended to understand in the first place. But every single time you choose not to chase, not to over-explain, not to shrink yourself to keep the peace, you are recalibrating that thermostat. You are teaching your own nervous system a new standard for what you will and will not accept. And that recalibration doesn't just affect this one relationship. It changes how you show up in every relationship that comes after it for the rest of your life. This is why so many people say that choosing silence, choosing to walk away, choosing to finally stop reaching for someone who never reached back becomes one of the most transformative decisions of their life, even separate from whatever happens with that other person. Because somewhere in the middle of that uncomfortable, panicked, sleepless silence, something else starts to grow. You start noticing how much energy you used to spend anticipating someone else's mood. You start noticing how much time you used to spend crafting the perfect message, waiting for the perfect reply, replaying conversations trying to figure out what you did wrong. And when all of that energy is no longer being poured into someone who never once asked how you were really doing, it has to go somewhere. It goes back into you, into the hobbies you dropped, into the friendships you neglected, into the version of yourself that existed before you started organizing your entire emotional life around someone else's inconsistency. There's also a quieter kind of power in this that doesn't get talked about enough. The power of becoming unpredictable to someone who thought they had you completely figured out. Most people, if we're honest, build their treatment of others based on pattern recognition. They learn what they can get away with. They learn how far they can push before you push back, if you ever do at all. And once that pattern is learned, most people don't consciously exploit it, but they do rely on it. They relax into it. They stop being careful because carefulness is only necessary when there's something at stake. The moment you break that pattern, when the person who always forgave stops forgiving, when the person who always initiated stops initiating, when the person who always chased finally stands still, you disrupt an entire internal model they built about who you are. And disrupting someone's internal model of you is one of the most psychologically destabilizing things you can do, not through cruelty, but simply through change. There is also something worth mentioning here about cognitive dissonance, because it explains a lot of the strange behavior people display once they realize the silence is real and not a temporary mood. Cognitive dissonance is the discomfort we feel when our actions don't match our self-image. Most people don't see themselves as someone who takes others for granted. They see themselves as a good friend, a good partner, a good son or daughter, even while behaving in ways that contradict that image completely. As long as you're still around, still reaching out, still forgiving, that contradiction never has to be confronted, because your continued presence seems to prove that things can't be that bad. But the moment you disappear from the equation, the story they've been telling themselves starts to fall apart. Suddenly they have to explain, at least to themselves, why someone who was always there simply isn't anymore. And that explanation almost always leads back to their own behavior, whether they admit it out loud or not. I want to bring this back to something practical, because understanding psychology is one thing, but living it is another. If you are in a season right now where you're considering finally going quiet, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion, out of self-respect, out of the quiet realization that you've been more consistent for someone else than they've ever been for you, know that the first few days will feel like the hardest part. Your brain will fight you. It will invent reasons to check on them, disguised as concern, disguised as closure, disguised as just one more conversation to explain yourself properly. Resist that urge, not because they don't deserve clarity, but because you've likely already given them more clarity than they ever earned. At some point, explaining becomes begging in disguise, and you don't owe anyone another explanation for choosing peace. What happens after that initial storm is something almost nobody describes accurately, because it isn't dramatic. It isn't a movie moment where they suddenly show up at your door professing everything they should have said months ago. Sometimes that happens. Often it doesn't. What usually happens instead is smaller, quieter, and in some ways more important. You start sleeping better. You stop reaching for your phone every few minutes, waiting for a notification that may never come. You start noticing music again, food again, mornings again. Not because the pain disappears instantly, but because you are no longer feeding a wound with the same hand that keeps reopening it. And somewhere in that quiet, whether or not the other person ever reaches out, ever apologizes, ever changes, you realize you've already gotten the thing you actually needed, not their return, your own. It's also worth saying that this process isn't linear. You won't wake up one day and simply be done feeling anything. There will be good days where the silence feels like strength, and there will be harder days, maybe triggered by a song, a memory, a place that reminds you of what used to be, where the silence feels unbearable again. That's not failure. That's what healing actually looks like. Messy and inconsistent, not the smooth, straight line we're often taught to expect. The goal was never to stop feeling anything. The goal was to stop organizing your entire life around someone who never organized theirs around you. So let me ask you this, because I want to know exactly where you're standing right now, in this exact moment, watching this. Is there someone in your life you already know, deep down, you need to stop chasing? Someone whose attention you've been earning instead of receiving? You don't have to name them. You don't have to explain the whole story. Just tell me in the comments, what would change in your life if you finally stopped explaining yourself to someone who never asked to understand you in the first place?